Picture this. You're 3 weeks into a cattle drive across Texas in 1880. No grocery stores, no refrigerators, no ice. The scorching sun beats down at 110 degrees. And you're responsible for feeding yourself and 20 other cowboys with nothing but the meat on your horse and the knowledge passed down from generations who survived in this brutal landscape. One mistake and that meat becomes a death sentence. Get it right and it could save your life. Today, we're diving into the forgotten survival techniques that kept cowboys alive in the Wild West. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are battle-tested methods that worked when failure meant starvation, and some of them might surprise you. The deadly challenge. Before we get into the techniques, you need to understand just how serious this problem was. Meat spoils fast, really fast. In the desert heat of the American West, a fresh piece of beef could become toxic in less than a day. And we're not talking about a little stomachache. We're talking about food poisoning that could kill you 50 miles from the nearest town. Cowboys didn't have the luxury of trial and error. They were moving 1,000 head of cattle across hundreds of miles of nothing. They couldn't just swing by a town if they got it wrong. The techniques they used had to work the first time, every time. The stakes were incredibly high. A cattle drive might last 3 to 4 months. That's a long time to keep men fed with no resupply options. Running out of food wasn't just uncomfortable. It was life-threatening. Weak, hungry cowboys couldn't control cattle. They couldn't defend against threats. They became liabilities. So how did they do it? Let's start with the most important method. Jerky, the ultimate survival food. If you've ever grabbed a bag of Jack Links at a gas station, you're eating a descendant of the most crucial survival food in cowboy history. But what cowboys made was nothing like what you buy today. It was harder, leaner, and could last for months without spoiling. The process started with the cut. Cowboys used the leanest meat possible, usually from the hindquarters of a steer. Fat is the enemy of preservation. Fat goes rancid, and rancid fat will ruin everything around it. So they trimmed away every bit of fat they could see. Then came the cutting. They sliced the meat with the grain, not against it, into strips about 1/4 inch thick. This isn't like slicing a steak for dinner. The grain of the muscle matters because it affects how the meat dries and how long it lasts. Here's where it gets interesting. Cowboys didn't usually salt their jerky heavily like we do today. Salt was expensive and heavy. On a long cattle drive, every pound mattered. Instead, they relied almost entirely on dehydration. They'd hang these strips of meat on makeshift racks, sometimes just ropes strung between trees or wagon wheels. The drying process took 2 to 3 days in good conditions. They needed sun, heat, and low humidity. At night, they'd sometimes bring the meat closer to the fire to keep it drying and protect it from animals. The goal was to remove about 75% of the moisture. When it was done, you could bend it, but it would crack if you bent it too far. But here's the genius part. Jerky wasn't just preserved meat, it was concentrated nutrition. 1 pound of fresh meat became about 4 ounces of jerky. That means a cowboy could carry a week's worth of protein in his saddlebag without it weighing him down. And there's another advantage most people don't think about. Jerky was versatile. You could eat it as is on the trail, you could rehydrate it in a stew, you could grind it up and mix it with other ingredients. It was the Swiss Army knife of trail food. Pemmican, the forgotten superfood. Now let's talk about something most people have never heard of. Pemmican. If jerky was the everyday food of the trail, pemmican was rocket fuel. Native Americans invented it, and smart cowboys learned to make it because it was arguably the most efficient survival food ever created. Pemmican starts with jerky, but then it goes further. Cowboys would pound the dried meat into a powder. I mean really pound it. They'd use rocks, rifle butts, whatever they had, until the meat was broken down into almost a dust. This took serious work. Then came the fat. Remember how I said fat was the enemy of preservation? This is the exception. Once meat is completely dried, rendered fat actually helps preserve it. Cowboys would render fat from the same animal, heating it slowly until it became liquid tallow. The key word here is rendered. Raw fat spoils. Properly rendered tallow can last for years. They'd mix this powder and hot fat in about a 1-to-1 ratio, sometimes adding dried berries if they could get them. The berries weren't just for flavor. They added vitamins that prevented scurvy on long journeys. Chokecherries, currants, and service berries were favorites. Then they'd pack it into whatever container they had. Rawhide bags were common. Some cowboys used cleaned-out intestines. When it cooled, pemmican became a dense, hard block that could survive anything. Heat, cold, rain, it didn't matter. And the caloric density was insane. A single pound of pemmican could sustain a working man for an entire day. It had protein from the meat, fat for energy, and if made right, enough vitamins to keep you healthy. But here's what made it truly special. It could last for years, decades even. There are documented cases of pemmican remaining edible after after 20 years of storage. Arctic explorers in the early 1900s relied on it exclusively for months at a time. Smoking, the science of preservation. Smoking meat is ancient, but cowboys had to master it in conditions that would make most pitmasters quit. No fancy smokers, no temperature gauges, just fire, meat, and knowledge. The process started with building the right fire. Cowboys didn't want flames, they wanted smoke. Lots and lots of smoke. They'd use green wood, often mesquite, hickory, or oak, depending on what was available. The wood choice mattered because different woods burned at different temperatures and produced different chemicals in their smoke. They'd construct a simple smoke tent using canvas, hides, or even just dig a pit and cover it. The meat would hang inside, while smoke from a separate fire pit would be channeled in. The key was keeping the temperature low. They weren't cooking the meat, they were drying it with smoke. Some cowboys got creative with their smokers. One method was to dig a trench from the fire pit to a covered hole where the meat hung. The smoke would travel through the trench, cooling down by the time it reached the meat. This is where the chemistry gets interesting. Smoke contains compounds that are toxic to bacteria. Formaldehyde, phenols, and other chemicals settle on the surface of the meat and create a protective barrier. At the same time, the heat is slowly evaporating moisture. It's a double attack on spoilage. The smoke also creates a pellicle, a tacky surface layer on the meat that helps seal it and gives it that distinctive glazed appearance. This pellicle is actually another layer of protection against bacteria and insects. A proper smoke job took anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on how long they needed the meat to last. Lightly smoked meat might last a week or two. Heavily smoked meat could last months. Salting, liquid gold for preservation. Salt was expensive in the Wild West, really expensive. In remote areas, it could cost as much as meat itself, but it was worth it because salt is arguably the most effective preservative humans have ever discovered. Cowboys used salt in several ways. The most straightforward was dry salting. They'd pack meat completely in salt, making sure every surface was covered. The salt draws moisture out of the meat through osmosis. Without moisture, bacteria can't grow. Simple, but incredibly effective. The process required patience. They'd pack a layer of salt, then a layer of meat, then more salt, building up in a wooden barrel or crate. The meat would sit for weeks, with the salt gradually pulling out moisture. Every few days, they'd drain off the liquid that accumulated at the bottom. But they couldn't always afford to use salt that liberally, so they developed more efficient methods. One was the brine. They'd dissolve salt in water, usually in a ratio of about 1 pound of salt to 8 pounds of water, and submerge the meat completely. The brine penetrates deeper into the meat than dry salt, preserving it from the inside out. Some cowboys would add other ingredients to their brine, a bit of sugar to balance the flavor, saltpeter to help maintain color and add extra preservation power, black pepper for its mild antimicrobial properties. The salted meat had to be rinsed before cooking, or it would be inedibly salty. This rinsing was an art in itself. Too little, and you'd pucker from the salt. Too much, and you'd wash away the preservative benefits, and the meat would spoil faster. Here's something interesting. Salt curing changes the texture and flavor of meat in ways many people grew to prefer. Salted beef developed a distinctive taste that became its own delicacy. It wasn't just preserved meat, it was a different product entirely. Corning, more than just beef. Corning is a specific type of salt preservation that cowboys used, especially for beef. The name comes from the large grains of salt used, called corns. This method combines dry salting with specific spices to create what we now call corned beef. Cowboys would pack beef in a mix of salt, sugar, and spices like black pepper, bay leaves, and sometimes juniper berries. The sugar wasn't just for taste, it helped offset the harsh saltiness and contributed to preservation by creating an environment bacteria didn't like. The meat would cure for weeks, being turned and repacked regularly. The result was beef that could last months and had a complex, savory flavor that plain salted meat lacked. It was labor-intensive, but the payoff was significant. The tools they carried. Cowboys traveled light, but certain tools were non-negotiable for meat preservation. A sharp knife, obviously. You can't make jerky with a dull blade. Many cowboys carried 2 knives, one for general use and one kept razor sharp specifically for processing meat. They needed a whetstone to keep knives sharp. Dull knives were dangerous, and they mangled meat, creating ragged edges that dried unevenly and spoiled faster. Salt, when they could afford it, in a waterproof container container. Getting salt wet was a disaster. Most cowboys used tin containers with tight lids or wrapped salt in oilcloth several times over. Rope or rawhide strips for hanging meat. These had to be clean and strong. A small folding canvas sheet that could become a smoke tent. Some carried a small pouch of spices for their antimicrobial properties. A good cooking pot was essential. It could render fat for pemmican, boil brine for pickling, or cook meals. And then there were the improvised tools. A flat rock became a grinding surface. A sturdy branch became a drying rack. Cowboys were masters of making do with what they had. The most important tool? Knowledge. Passed down from experienced cowboys to greenhorns, written in no books, just learned by watching, trying, sometimes failing, and always remembering what happened when it went wrong. We should talk about the failures because they were deadly serious. Botulism from improperly processed meat killed people. Trichinosis from underprocessed pork was a constant threat. Even minor food poisoning on the trail could be fatal if it left you too weak to ride. Cowboys developed ways to test meat. The smell test, obviously. Fresh meat smells clean. Spoiling meat smells sour or putrid. But also the texture test. Slimy meant spoiled. The color test was crucial too. Meat turning green or showing rainbow sheens was dangerous. They'd sometimes do the cut test, slicing into the center of a piece to see if the inside had stayed good, even if the outside looked questionable. If the interior looked different from the exterior, discolored or soft, the whole piece was suspect. When meat went bad, there was no saving it. They'd bury it far from camp to avoid attracting predators. It was a total loss, which, on a long drive, could mean the difference between adequate supplies and going hungry. Some outfits kept records of how much meat they lost to spoilage. It could be as high as 10 to 20% on summer drives. That's why preservation skills were so valued. A cowboy who could reduce that loss even by a few percentage points earned his keep and then some. The economic reality. Let's talk money for a minute because it puts everything in perspective. A steer in 1880 might be worth $20 to $30 delivered to market. That same steer, if you had to buy processed beef from a supplier, could cost $50 or more in preserved meat. Cowboys who could preserve their own meat saved their outfits serious money. A chuck wagon cook who was skilled in preservation techniques was worth his weight in gold. Some earned double what regular cowboys made. The economics also explain why cowboys were so careful with preservation. Wasting meat wasn't just losing food, it was throwing away money. An outfit that consistently lost meat to poor preservation would go broke. Regional variations. Preservation techniques varied by region. Texas cowboys did things differently than Montana cowboys. In the humid southeast, smoking was more important because air drying was less reliable. In the arid southwest, sun drying was king. Coastal cowboys had access to salt more easily than those inland. Regional game also affected techniques. Cowboys in bison territory learned methods that worked best for buffalo. Those in elk country adapted their techniques for that meat. The modern connection. Here's why all of this matters today. These techniques work right now. They're not historical curiosities. They're proven methods that require no electricity, no special equipment, just knowledge and effort. In an emergency, knowing how to make jerky could feed your family. Understanding salting could preserve a hunting kill. The principles haven't changed. Bacteria still need moisture. Smoke still has antimicrobial properties. Salt still works the same way it did in 1880. More than that, there's something profound about understanding how people survived with less. Cowboys didn't have technology. They had knowledge, observation, and the willingness to learn from those who came before them. The lost skills. What we've lost isn't just the techniques, it's the whole relationship with food that made these techniques necessary. Cowboys knew exactly where their meat came from because they were often trailing it on the hoof. They understood the full cycle from living animal to preserved food. They knew which cuts preserved best. They understood fat ratios. They could judge meat quality by touch and smell in ways that would seem like magic to us now. They had an intimate knowledge of how weather, temperature, and humidity affected preservation. This wasn't academic knowledge. It was practical, hands-on understanding built from necessity. Get it wrong, and people went hungry. Get it right, and you'd earned your place on the trail. The cowboys of the Wild West weren't just tough guys on horses. They were survival experts who mastered the science of food preservation using nothing but natural materials and hard-won knowledge. Every piece of jerky was a small victory against spoilage and starvation. Every batch of pemmican was insurance against disaster. These techniques kept them alive in one of the harshest environments in America. No grocery stores, no refrigeration, no safety net. Just meat, sun, smoke, salt, and the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. And the wild thing, all of this knowledge almost disappeared. We came within a generation of losing these skills entirely, but they're still here, still valid, still useful. Whether you're interested in history, survival, survival, or just understanding how humans adapted to incredible challenges, these techniques represent some of the most practical knowledge our ancestors possessed. The next time you grab a piece of beef jerky, remember, you're eating a food that crossed the American frontier, survived wars, fed explorers, and sustained people in conditions we can barely imagine. That's not just a snack, that's a piece of living history. And now you know how it was made. You know the work that went into it, the skill, the knowledge, the absolute necessity of getting it right. That's the real story of the Wild West. Not just gunfights and cattle drives, but everyday survival, practical skills, knowledge passed down and hard won. People making do with what they had, and not just surviving, but thriving. And maybe, just maybe, some of that knowledge is worth preserving just as carefully as they preserved their meat.